Okay, we are now reconvened in open session. We will now consider action on closed session items. Mrs. Tossan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to appoint Brian Gwynn to the position of Executive Director of Finance.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Tossan and a second by Mrs. James.
Discussion.
Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote by show of hands. Motion passes.
Congratulations, Mr. Gwynn.
Next up is board governance. Dr. Dupree.
Yes, as you may recall, we have changed the format for the meeting minutes. So we have meeting minutes in this agenda that go back to April 9th. And I would point out that there is not an agenda action item in the board book. However, they are posted on the agenda and all the minutes are there for your review, and we will have that corrected for the voting meeting next week.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree.
And just as for a reference, excuse me, Mr. Burdine, if I can say something.
Yes, ma'am.
So the board knows, I have not looked at any of these. So I will do that in the next few days, but I've not seen them at all until I got them this weekend.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Let us know how we can support you in that. Next is our review proposed order authorizing redemption of bonds. Do we have any questions?
Well, the main purpose of this is for us to be able to maintain our tax rate by paying off the additional 1.6 million in debt. So that's the purpose of this item.
Mr. Burdine, my only question is to ask Mr. Frells if he's had a chance to review the order and if everything's in order.
Everything's in order, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mrs. James, did you have a question? Okay. Moving on, the review of proposed resolution approving the 2018 tax year tax roll. Any questions? Next, review of proposed resolution adopting the 2018 ad valorem tax rate. Moving on, review of the proposed Texas Education Agency exemption waiver for the class size and grades K through 4 for elementary schools. Mrs. James.
Might have been answered, but we don't have a list of this yet, and will that be provided to us?
No, ma'am, we're refining it, and we want to make sure you see the accurate list before we
Thank you.
before
I
we
don't
distribute it.
want to confuse my brain with any more details
That's
than I
our
already
goal.
have in there.
Next, review of the proposed remote instruction homebound and dual credit waivers. All right, moving on. Review proposed purchases exceeding $50,000. Looks like we have some Braille vision services, special education skilled nursing services, speech services, professional staff development. Good.
Wait, did you just go through all A through D all together?
I did.
Okay, yes.
All right. Mrs. Tossan, I'm sorry.
That's a lot all at once.
All right.
So I'm going to start with the Braille vision services. And I just had a question. I was looking at the metrics, the rubric, and I noticed that one or two of our vendors were scored pretty low on our agreement to the Fort Bend ISD terms and conditions. So I'm wondering how that impacts us being able to use them. Do we negotiate contracts that are outside of our regular terms and conditions? I don't know who can answer that. I mean, one of them got a 0. Does that mean they're not agreeing to anything we're proposing?
when they get the lower scores, it's because they're proposing red lines, and we do run that through our legal department. If it's acceptable, then we are able to do business.
Okay, so we just decide whether we are or aren't
Correct.
based on that?
Just based
Okay.
on what they're doing. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
We can move one by one.
Okay, that'd be great.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Next, I'm sorry about that. Next, 3B is the special education skilled nursing services. None. Next, we have speech services, sign language interpreting, independent educational evaluations, language translations, LLSP services.
Yeah, so I had one thing I wanted to point out and then one question. So I know in our audit, that one of the issues we had was with getting our evaluations done in a timely manner and in accordance with law. So are we going to be able to contract with our LSSPs and evaluators in order to address that issue?
So last year, we had a similar RFP out, and we used contracted vendors throughout the year. We did it again this year to add to that list with the hopes of adding some additional, particularly LSSPs and LPCs. I think that's in there as well, really because of that piece.
Okay, so our expectation is to be able to address those deficiencies
Absolutely.
through the added, I think we had added staff as well.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really, if we can maintain our staff and if we can utilize these contracted services, we'll get the work done. It's just being able to find the staff to do this.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I wanted to point out is I noticed that we've increased our annual budget in this area by about $150,000. And so one of the things I just wanted to point out that we have to be mindful of as a board and as a district is that the increased identification of students qualifying for special education is one of those reasons, which obviously I would say that's a positive because our kids are getting identified, who should be identified, and we are serving the children who need to be served. But another thing that impacts that is the TEA corrective action plan, which TEA developed, but has not really put any money towards to the ISDs. So we have to keep this in mind. I'm not, sometimes these things get very complicated, but sitting on the Special Education Continuing Advisory Committee, I dove pretty deep into that corrective action plan, and there were many things in it that were concerning to me, not the least of which is that the entire financial burden is placed on the school districts, not only for the increase that students who are the increase in identification, but also for any compensatory services for students who were not previously identified and who should have been. And the rationale for that from TEA is that, well, you would have had to pay that anyway, districts. But the difference is that we would have been, the weight for that student would have been different when they were identified, because students are weighted according to, am I correct, Mr. Bassett? Yeah, so we're literally going to be losing money, and the state has come up with no way to help us, to give us more funding for that. And I anticipate and predict that it's going to impact our budget significantly over the next few years. So I think we should be watching that, and it's probably one of the things we should keep in mind as we talk to our legislators, that this is one of those costs that's being swept under the rug and nobody's talking about, and it's going to be a big one for us, I think. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point. Thank you, Mrs. James.
I want to thank Kristen for saying that, and say that I'll get that on the list of the district advisory team so that we can bring that to the attention of Representative Miller at the very least. But when we get to talking about our legislative priorities in the category of funding, let's list that.
Thank you both. Next, B3D, professional staff development, technical assistance, program evaluation for special education topics. Mrs. Towson.
So I just wanted to point out here that I saw that part of this ask is for utilization of a vendor to assist with the development of basically the enhancement of the modifications into Schoology. Is that what I read? I read that correctly? So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you guys for including that, because it is one of the things the board's been asking for, are those embedded modifications. It's gonna help all of our teachers, especially our general education teachers, who really need support and professional development when it comes to these kinds of things. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think I'm glad that we're doing that, and I look forward to offering that for our students and for our teachers.
All right. Next, C1, review of proposed interlocal agreement regarding Saved by the Bell. Mr. Rosenthal.
So, we haven't seen at least I haven't seen a truancy update for a while, it seems like. And I'm kind of curious how our numbers are looking, and I would really like to see that before approving this. You know, I've been in favor of this in the past. I'm just, one, I'd like to know if it's effective, and two, I think we should all, you know, get to see some of that data on whether or not our rates are going back out of control, since there's really not much regulation on it anymore. So it'd be good to get a view of that.
Mr. Rosenthal, we actually submitted some data maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can go ahead and get that data for you.
Okay.
and send it to you, because it does show that the program has been assisting.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That would be some good information to have. We appreciate that. Next, D1, review proposed resolution designating a delegate and alternate to the General Assembly of the Houston-Galveston Area Council for the year of 2019.
I think it should be KP and Addie.
All right.
And if y'all are watching, you're not here to defend yourselves.
So, thanks for the comic relief. So what are we going to do about this here? Who would like to do this?
KP and Addie.
Second.
So, okay, well. So can we, how do we do this? No, everyone's avoiding me here, so.
You know, I've never looked at it. We've always done a board member. Maybe we need to research, could a staff member be the district's delegate?
Well, and so I'll also just say that technically the delegate doesn't have to attend all of the meetings. Usually it's one trustee who sits on the board. And then whichever trustee is our delegate is just supposed to basically be attentive.
Right,
What's
so
happening.
how it works is that all the ISDs in the Houston-Galveston area put one person in the mix, and then those ISDs get on a conference call with the executive director, and they decide amongst themselves who will be the person that actually sits on the board. And the last 2 years, it's been a lady from Magnolia, I believe, whose name I can't recollect right now, but I was on the call when she decided to do it, and I was happy for her. And she felt at that point like she wanted to follow through on the commitment she'd made the previous year because of we were just past Hurricane Harvey, and she wanted to help complete some of the recovery things. So that's kind of how that goes. You still can get the information and be engaged in it, but, and there is good information, but, so.
Sounds like you might want to do it.
No, I
Well, you're
don't
an
necessarily, I don't. It's just one more thing. I think Addie should do it because she's not here and she's the vice president.
Okay. All right.
Second.
Addie it is. Addie, So I do remember doing this several years ago, 2 years ago, when I was on the phone conversation with 3 other people, and someone got the short straw, so.
Or the long straw, depending
Or,
on
there you
your
go, I'm sorry, that's right. Okay, moving on. Mrs. Helliger is going to be our delegate, and I'll be the alternate.
And you can
I
call
think
her
that's an
and tell her
excellent
that.
idea for our officers to lead in that way.
Yes, ma'am. We're on it. Next is review proposed donations exceeding $10,000. What's that? Okay. They're not here. They're not.
So,
No, from the agenda.
Okay. Go ahead, Mrs. Tossan, I'm
so
sorry.
I'll support here by saying that the Commonwealth Elementary PTA donation to Commonwealth Elementary for the lab equipment for $21,305. Thank you very much to the PTA. I think that's great. The my only question was the Sienna Plantation Residential Association donated $30,000 to Leonetti. Is that designated for anything in particular?
Not that I'm aware of, but we can certainly look into that.
Just for,
Do you recall any?
Generally, in the case of a new school, that's done to kind of help get the
like the
activities
teacher
done.
equipment and or I don't know.
Get their
I was-
activity fund started,
Okay,
usually.
I was just curious. Usually we see a designation, so,
Yeah, I mean, if we were given one, we would have put it on here.
yeah. Okay. I think that's great.
I have a quick question.
This is Mrs. James.
So related to the Commonwealth, I thought that we were doing iPads at the elementary level was our sort of modus operandi. And, I mean, I'm not against laptops, but I don't know if this is fitting into our curriculum efforts and our whole.
So our proposal is pre-K, kindergarten, first grades are iPads, and second through 12 are laptops. So it does fit very well within our.
Okay, so
Yes,
second
ma'am.
through 12th is not.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then how do we pull these big semi-trailers that these bands have? 'Cause this is another one, because we're up to 3 or 4 of them now.
We actually have a contract with a company for the tractor.
Oh, so we don't have like Booster Club moms and dads out
Not
there driving?
usually,
If you would let us, we would.
not usually.
So, I had a quick question about this. Is there a budget already in place for this to happen, and this is above that budget that we give them, or is this something that's, I mean, can you,
These are all donations above and beyond the budgets that we give these campuses.
You mean to pull the trailer?
no, not to pull the trailer, but just 35, for example, does every school have a semi-trailer for their
Well,
band equipment?
No, as far as the school bands, I mean, most of them do. Most of them have big enough bands where they need that kind of thing. And they have enough participation where their boosters usually help support that.
So this is just a highly customized trailer in addition to,
Yeah.
okay.
Put the logo on it and all kinds of stuff. Very
But-
creative.
But Mr. Burdine, what you're saying is this is an example of inequity between campuses who can raise $35,000 to buy a trailer versus those who cannot. And there is inequity, and when we have these donations, it highlights that because some of our schools don't have the fundraising ability to raise this kind of money to provide these resources to the kids, whether that's laptops at the elementary or whatever's going into Leonetti or a trailer for their marching band. And that's a problem.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Next, we have Scalable Systems, review the proposed staffing positions for safety and security.
I'm happy to see these and completely support them. Just want to say that.
Agreed. Moving on, E2, review of the proposed price increase of adult breakfast meal to $2.25. Mrs. Tossan.
I just felt like I needed to point out publicly that we have no control over pricing, that is dictated by the federal government, and that is why we are increasing the price of our adult breakfast meal.
So I also wanted to point out, we have not increased the price since 2010 for those that may be watching, so. Moving on,
That's actually
Ms.
one of the reasons that we had a huge surplus in our child nutrition fund was because the federal government forced us to raise our rates back in 2010,
Thank you.
12 or whatever it was. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Next, E3, review of proposed removal of uncollectible property tax accounts. All right. E4, review of proposed budget amendment to the general fund fiscal year budget for 2018-19.
We actually have a brief presentation on this one.
So,
Brief being the operative term.
yes, sir. I got it. We can, we do, it's not, no, it's not that many. We will be brief, but I mean, overall, it's a good story. So, here are the numbers that you saw when we adopted the budget in June. You can see, what we were estimating in 17-18 at that time. Use of economic stabilization of 1.5 million, and then you can see, 5.86 whenever we adopted the budget. So we got some good news with regard to Hurricane Harvey receiving some significant grant money, federal monies that went through the state for our allocation based on our student demographics, the relocation of kids from Seguin, to multiple campuses, other things along those lines really impacted those grant numbers, very significant and significantly higher than the Harvey expenditures that we've booked. The other big number in there is, we had already talked to you a little bit about, the insurance recovery from Harvey, but the state compensatory education adjustment of almost $9 million. So just trying to make it really brief, whenever the waivers came out for all school districts to be able to eat free, at that time, according to TDA, we did not qualify for that because we did not have any point of sale issues. Several districts had point of sale issues where they could not identify whether or not a kid was free or reduced. And because of that, they said everybody eats free. Well, even though we didn't qualify for that per TDA, we appealed to TEA because we had the same kind of disruption and displacement that other school districts had. And in the end, TEA agreed with us, and they actually did a rule change to help us and several other districts that did not qualify for that waiver. And so, we kind of fought that battle. It took a while for us to get that, and we had no assurances that we were going to get any of this whenever we adopted the budget and showed you guys those last numbers. So things really crystallized in the July timeframe, and we finally saw that state comp adjustment in the summary of finance for 17-18 to the extent that our auditors are happy with it, and it's going to be in our financials. So anyway, that's the I'm trying to be short on this. So what does that mean? We think we'll finish 17-18 with a surplus of 16.4 million. Okay, so that's the net result of the impact of those numbers. Very significant. Okay, 18-19. We also have some good news. Whenever we were budgeting 3% value growth. It's closer to 4. Okay, so that's where that 4.6 comes from. We also our Purdue Brandon, that the property attorneys, they'll do ongoing look at our CPTD values to see if they could be lowered such that they go through audits. They submitted information on our behalf to the state, and so we are going to have a one-time adjustment based on 16-17 for 16-17 values to the tune of 1.75. That was our initial estimate. Whenever we put the budget amendment together, we'll get a little bit more, and you'll see that later. So looking at the numbers, though, we think that we squeezed the teaching and learning budget a little too hard, okay? And so we wanted, in working with that department, we decided to add $580,000 back into teaching and learning. The annual encumbrance rollover, which you see annually, is bringing over POs year over year. That number is actually less than you've seen, but 3.7. And then the PD positions that you just got finished talking about, the impact of this year is almost $1 million. So there's the positions that you spoke about. You know, there was plenty of detail in the memo and the agenda item. So what does that mean? So the amended budget would have us see us dipping into the budget to the tune of 4.7 million. Okay, so it's just a better picture than where we were. But we've received some more information since, you know, even when we put this together that we're going to go over next. I'll let our new executive director speak about it briefly.
Thank you, Steve. So on the revenue adjustments, one of the other factors that figures into our property tax revenues is collections from frozen values. And this is a little bit of a misnomer. It actually is the ceiling for seniors who are over 65 as well as people who are disabled. We're seeing about $4.2 million in additional revenue from that. In the next two slides, I'll walk you through exactly what that means. We also have a one-time audit adjustment from CPTD that's on, or not in addition to, it's in addition to what Steve showed you of about $250,000. And then we have some expenditure adjustments that will be coming forward as well. One is for a new position teacher pool. As you recall, we had 15 teachers that were established in a pool when the budget was adopted. However, we were extremely tight in terms of adding new teaching units at schools. We held very strictly to 22-1. However, as we've gone through the first day of school, we have some campuses that need those additional units to make sure they're at 22-1, particularly at our Tier 3 campuses. Also, for our electricity forecast, we had initially anticipated about $1.5 million in savings on that. As we looked at how we ended last year, that's looking like it may have been a little bit too optimistic, and we're recommending adding about $1.5 million back in for electricity to make sure we don't fall short in that particular area. And then security investments, this $190,000 is specifically for equipment related to those positions we just showed you a few moments ago. And then two items that we would be bringing back to the board for consideration that would be implemented in the November timeframe would be a teacher supplement of $500. This is over and above the step increase that teachers were given. And then for non-teachers, a 2% retention supplement that would be up to $1,000. So if you look at the teacher side, the $500 retention supplement they receive plus this $500 would put them at $1,000, and then employees could receive that are non-teachers 2% up to $1,000. So no one would exceed $1,000.
Let me just say something briefly on this. So the whole point of this is to make sure we're being sensitive to the fact that we weren't able to give a raise to employees. And remember the difference between the retention supplement and raises. Raises are the gift that keeps on giving. It's compounded over time. And so this is just reflective of the one-time benefit that we receive from those federal grants and the state comp ed, and the one-time benefit for that. We feel comfortable passing that on, as opposed to doing a general salary increase. And you'll see how this all folds into a 3-year forecast here in a few minutes.
So the total cost of that would be just under $5.5 million if the board were to choose to move forward with that recommendation. So I mentioned just a moment ago, we have about $4.2 million in additional revenue coming from the over 65 and disabled person ceiling. To give you a brief background, the over 65 and disabled person ceiling places a limit on the taxes paid on a resident for those who are over 65 or disabled. This was implemented by the state, and it's sometimes referred to as frozen, but that's, again, a misnomer because that value or that dollar amount can move down, so it's not set in stone. So anyone who is over 65 that has a homestead exemption automatically qualifies for this. They don't have to do anything besides apply for the homestead exemption as they normally would. And the tax ceiling is set in the amount of taxes paid the year that the residents qualified for that over 65 exemption. And the value of the property continues to grow. However, the amount of the tax bill is set. And the only way that that can change is if one of two factors are met. First, if the valuation declines below the amount that it was set when the freeze was established, so that would mean they would pay less. And the other is if an improvement is made on the homestead that would increase the ceiling, such as they add a pool, a game room, et cetera, that new value is captured, but it's frozen at the level in the year in which it's captured. So those are two areas where it's not truly frozen. Those amounts can change over time. And as we've advertised as part of the bond, this is why those that are over 65 generally will not be impacted by the change in the tax rate because of this. It would be if they met one of these two criteria that they would see a change. So as we look at this, that number is significant. Part of the question we ask ourselves is why is that growing? And part of that is because the over 65 population in Fort Bend County is growing at a faster rate than the general population. The 3-year growth between 2015 and 17, we grew at about 14.7% for those over 65 compared to about 6.8% for the general population. And essentially what that means is that there are people who are over 65 that are moving to the county as opposed to just a natural aging process. So there's a benefit to that in that we're gaining that extra tax dollars, but unfortunately there is a ceiling on that. And then if we look at the actual percentage of our residents that are over 65, right now it stands at about 11%, and that has been growing from about 9% back in 2015. And then finally, the number of over 65 homesteads, if you look at that, it increased 9% over last year. We went from just over 20,000 to about 22,000 in the current tax year. So the net impact of that is that the over 65 growth has been volatile as we look at this. So the graph on the right shows you, if you look at what the valuation, what the change was from the preliminary at the time we received it in April through the certified roll, and you can see there are some pretty big jumps in 14 and 18. So that's why this one caught us a little bit off guard. The reason that 14 didn't stand out as much to us is because that was a year where we had double-digit regular growth, so that amount was mixed into our regular growth. In this particular case, it wasn't mixed in, so it was easier to put our finger on. But again, when we used a 3% growth for that valuation, it came in obviously considerably higher, and that represents about $4.2 million in recurring revenue. And we have incorporated that amount into our long-range forecasts in addition to those values that Steve talked about just a moment ago. So we'd like to walk you through our 3-year outlook very briefly. Our property value growth, we have made an adjustment to that since we last reviewed the information with you back in June. We've changed it to 5%, which aligns with the planning that we did for the bond. We didn't feel like it would make sense to have those two numbers out of alignment. We also made one change to state revenue, and that is to the Austin yield. We've increased it by $10 per year. You may recall that the Austin yield is part of the state formula process, and it is pegged to the Austin values. Steve had a conversation with the CFO of Austin, and they continue to see very high growth. And since that number is pegged directly to Austin yield, the Austin yield, we do expect that to change. And the rate has typically been $20 or greater. I think it even is $100 in some years. So we feel $10 is a very conservative number to use for that out-year growth. On the expenditure side, I won't go through each of these. I'll just point out two additions that we have made. One is to the health care fund, where, as we've seen, health care inflation continues to be a major issue. So we're including $2 million per year that would be part of a health care contribution. And it was nice to hear earlier there was a discussion about special education. We have carved out $500,000 that is growing annually. So in 1920, it will be $500,000. The following year, it increases to $1 million. And by the third year, we have it up to $1.5 million. So we have something set aside for the potential that we would see either coming from the Gibson audit, as we heard from a few weeks ago, as well as that state findings where we may have to make adjustments. So those are the two changes that have been made since we last reviewed this with you back in June. So for the 3-year outlook, you may recall, I won't hit 18-19, and that year we were balanced. 19-20, however, has also moved so that we are within 90 days of fund balance policy. You may recall when we adopted the budget, we were below fund balance policy there. The thing that I would say, as we said when we adopted the budget, if you look in 20 and 21 and 21-22, we are falling below policy. However, as we put the budget together each year, our direction from board policy is to bring you a balanced budget that does not dip below 90 days. So this is just a picture of what if everything played out exactly as we have it laid out. And there has been an improvement since we last showed you this, so we did want to show you that as we began making these decisions around security audit, et cetera, we do have capacity to take on those expenditures. And as I turn it back over to Steve, I don't have any Latin lesson tonight, but I will point out that the reason that the ancient Romans were so bad at math is because they always solved for x, and x equals 10.
Okay, all right. Moving right along.
Brian, I used to tell that joke at the Elkins Math Honor Society. And it never got a laugh.
Well, it's good to know I got one here. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so just some of the future considerations. Some of y'all may have heard directly. I've heard directly from our lieutenant governor that they still do expect to hold school districts that were impacted by Harvey harmless to some extent with regard to property value loss. You know, while we've had a 4% overall growth, if you look at the trend from the prior 2 years, it should have been higher. And so how they're going to calculate that, I do not know. But the lieutenant governor is on record to have some one-time assistance for this that they would use out of the rainy day fund. Again, as we learn more, we'll let you know about it. But I do expect that to be a 7-figure number. We'll see what that looks like. These numbers also don't include anything more that we collect from FEMA and other insurance collections. And so that's stuff we're still hounding those dollars. As we mentioned, you know, I am expecting more in the Austin yield. You know, when we did the forecast before, we were just showing what was in the template, what was shown in the template in those years. But we know better that those numbers are going to change. And so we wanted to bring you a more realistic picture this time. Now, state funding formulas can change. There's been a lot of discussion on what's come up with the commission. So that's why I have pluses and minuses there. You know, we'll just have to see what happens, and we'll be updating you on that as we go along in my trips that I'll start having to Austin soon. And then also we are expecting additional investments in literacy and you know, some of the other campuses that we spoke about earlier. So, you know, we don't know what those numbers are, and we haven't included those in here yet. So action, hopefully the board will approve the amendment next week. In October, we'll bring an additional amendment where you'll have those other outlines those other things that we outlined for October, including the cost of the retention supplement. We see the retention supplement being paid out in November, at the November 15th paycheck, and then we'll bring a budget update and legislative update in January, February. Now, one of the things, this is unrelated to the budget, but I wanted to show you this, and it's unfortunate one of those numbers is cutting off over on the side. But, you know, we always get asked about how efficient we are or inefficient we are or bloated we are and whatever else. And so this was actually new to me in terms of coming up with new ways to slice and dice our numbers. And we know that our budget is over 80%, 88% staff. If you just look at our staff, only 1% of our staff is in general administration, 1%. And so that includes superintendent, finance, HR, community relations, student affairs, accounts payable, benefits. The list could go on. Additional 1% for IT, 2% devoted to security. 79% is campus-based staffing. 79%. 8% is the campus support services. A lot of that is in function 13, which is a curriculum development, okay, and instructional leadership, function 21. So you can look anybody in the eye and say our general administration makes up 1% of our staff. And every company has to have at least 1% to pay the bills, to HR, all of those functions. So anyway, it was just kind of a new way for us to slice and dice, and we just wanted to take that opportunity for you to see that. We'll be happy to take any other questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett and Mr. Gwynn. Mrs. Tossan, do you have a question?
I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for that last slide, because that is helpful, especially as we're gearing up for the session. I'd also like to say I really appreciate our 1%, and you are all extremely necessary. So the other question I have is, so thank you for showing us what you're going to be adding to special education, and what is the justification, or not the justification, how did we come up with 500,000?
That is just an estimate on for me, just based on experience, but also it's hard to find people to give these services. There's as those, so there's going to be a capacity limit that'll end up being met as more and more kids are identified. There's only going to be so many people to provide those services, and yes, the cost for those folks are going to go up, and supply and demand. But I do think that unfortunately it'll top out until the education system and everything ramps up enough to bring in people to provide all these services. And so That's how I come up with that number. But now it'll compound each year.
Right.
What this doesn't include is the revenue impact from the additional identification, because we're not sure.
No.
Okay, so
that's
we
your
would have
best
some,
estimate.
we would have some offsetting revenue, but I didn't want to take a swag at that, but I did want to at least put a placeholder in there.
Well, thank you for putting the placeholder. I think that that's at least a first step until we get a handle on what the impact is
Yeah.
really gonna be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. Mr. Rice?
Mr. Bassett, Mr. Gunn, I just have a kind of a rhetorical question for you, and that is in the board agenda item, it says additional revenues are based on the certified tax roll coming in at 0.97% greater than the preliminary, which puts us close to 4%. Is that right?
Yes.
And that yields an additional $2 million in additional revenue. So if we had a 2.5% cap, we would not be receiving this $2 million of additional funds.
You're correct.
And Commissioner Mike Morath just testified last week. He's asking for $3.5 billion less in funding from the state because they're anticipating a 6.85% increase in property taxes statewide. So it's a pretty clear illustration of what I call the clawback at work. And I don't understand anyone who would propose a 2.5% cap on property tax value. Where do they think they're going to get the money from? What other mechanism does the state have, since we have an over-reliance on local property taxes? You don't have to agree, but that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Rice. Thank you both. We appreciate the presentation. And like Mrs. Tossan said, I really appreciate that last slide. Good work. Next, we have E6A Bond 2018 Review of the Proposed Package. I'm sorry. E5 Review the Proposed School Boundary Community Engagement Services. Excuse me.
I just had one quick question.
Go ahead, Mrs. Tossan.
I was reading the list of things in the agenda item, and I just wanted to make sure that small group meetings with the trustees will be included in this. Because, okay, I expressed that the other day, that I wanted to make sure that the trustees had the opportunity to have meetings as we did through the last process. I thought they were helpful.
Yes, ma'am, you will, and pending or upon board approval, we'll be sharing a much more detailed timeline and get those dates calendared.
Thank you. Next, E6A Bond 2018 Review of the Proposed Package 2 MDF IDF Upgrades and Total Project Budget.
Mr. Bedeen?
Yes, sir.
We're gonna make one minor adjustment on the agenda item, because we forgot, I neglected to put the amount on there, on the recommendation. No?
Okay,
Was it?
so
It's in here.
It's in there, okay.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I
Is it
think what
the-
he's, excuse me, but I think what he's saying is it's not in the sentence of the recommendation that we'd
That's
be
correct.
approving.
okay. So we'll get that corrected for next week.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Can
Mrs. James?
Okay, I had trouble understanding I'm gonna, never mind, I'll ask my question offline, because I was having trouble understanding the chart, so, never mind.
All right. Moving along, 6B, review of the proposed professional services agreement with M. Arthur Gensler, J. and Associates Incorporated to Meadows Elementary School Design Services. All right. Next, 6C, review of the proposed project management information system for the 2018 bond program. Mr. Rice?
Mr. Perez, I'm understanding that we're acquiring this from Jacobs. Is that right? Or so we're going to now own Prolog or have the license agreement to Prolog, so we can use it going forward?
Yes, sir. Excuse me. The first item of business is a $0 transfer of the license from Jacobs to Fort Bend ISD. And then this is to go ahead and purchase the rights to it for the next 4 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Next, 6D, review of the proposed professional services agreement with Fluger Architects for additional design, consulting, and construction administrative services associated with the classroom expansion at Elementary School 51. All right. Next, 7A, review the proposed purchases exceeding $50,000 for fleet vehicles, ATVs, and golf carts. Next, vendors for furniture, fixtures, and equipment at the James Reese Career and Technical Center. I was going to say. Next, demographic services. Agreed. All right. Next on the agenda is audience items. Mrs. Carrie Waschenfelder. Mrs. Waschenfelder, you have 3 minutes. Mr. Rosenthal will be keeping the time. Mrs. Tossan will be keeping the time. She'll give you a 30-second warning.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Carrie Waschenfelder, and I serve as president of Fort Bend AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, with 1,900 members. Our union was disappointed and demoralized when the budget was approved in June without a significant or any kind of a raise for our classified workers. Now we learn of a budget amendment that will bring parity and equity to our classified workers and hand them a heartening message of a raise or a supplement. And a pay raise by any other name is still money in your pocket. So on behalf of the 1,900 members, I want to thank the administration, Dr. Bassett, now Mr. Gwynn, Dr. Dupree, for such great work at balancing the budget, stretching the dollars, managing our funds, so that all the employees get the pay raise that they deserve and so desperately need. I want all the board members to understand and to know that we need your vote on this budget amendment. I don't take anything for granted, even though the numbers sound very good and the presentation was very fulfilling and gratifying. I still know that we still need a vote, and so we're asking you for that vote. With this vote, we will give a much-needed boost to our custodians, secretaries, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, groundskeepers, cafeteria workers, technicians, and all other employees who, along with the indomitable teachers and our staff, open a window to all of our children and encourage them to walk through to meet the world that they face. So I'm asking you for that vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Waschenfelder. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Meeting is adjourned.
Somebody needs to second it.
Who's going to, I'm sorry, a motion by Mrs. Tossan and a second by Mrs. James. We are adjourned.